Chapter 23. The Emergency Meeting. From the uphill and downhill neighborhoods, people converged on Main Street. Frowning, worried-looking men, mothers holding the hands of young children, other children following along, unusually quiet. Everyone was unusually quiet, in fact. When they spoke at all, it was in low voices, just to exchange a few questions. What's this about? Do you know? Have no idea. Must be something serious. Maybe something new from the prophet. Maybe so. They hurried past the dark windows of stores, which had closed early, down past the deserted park, down toward the very end of Main Street, a stream of people, almost all the citizens of Yonwood. Though not quite all, Nicky remembered. Hoyt McCoy wouldn't be there, and Grover wouldn't, because he was up in the woods somewhere, and no doubt there were a few other Yonwood citizens who didn't come when Brenda Beeson called. But certainly most of the town was now pouring into the narrow, upright building that was the Church of the Fiery Vision. Once Nicky got past the crush of people at the door, she saw a long room filled with rows of wooden pews. High in the walls were windows of stained glass, but because the sky outside was growing dark, she couldn't make out the pictures in them. The light inside the church was dim, too. It came from candles placed in dozens of spots around the room. They lit up the aisles and the seats, but the space above, up to the ceiling, was a gulf of darkness. Quickly and quietly, people filed into the pews and sat down. Nicky sat toward the back. Then came long moments when nothing happened. People whispered and rustled, waiting. At last a door opened behind the pulpit, and Mrs. Beeson came out. She climbed up the steps to the pulpit and stood there, looking out at the crowd. The whispering immediately died down. There was no hat of any kind today. Mrs. Beeson's hair was fluffed out in a cloud around her head, and she wore a red dress with her round blue tower button pinned to the front. She stood looking out at them in silence for a long time, her eyes flitting from one face to another. At last she spoke. There was a wave of creaks and rustles as everyone leaned forward to hear. "Well, friends," she said, "we're in a dark time." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. "Our prophet has seen a dreadful disaster in the world's future. It could be the war that might be coming. It could have to do with the terrorist in our woods." The crowd murmured again. "But she's also tried to tell us how to be safe from this disaster. I call that a miracle. It's like being taken under God's wing." Mrs. Beeson smiled, and Nicky could tell that the people in the room were feeling that smile's warm glow. "And so most of us," Mrs. Beeson went on, "have done our best to do what our prophet tells us to do. It's not always easy to know what that is. Sometimes the prophet says things that even I can't interpret. She says no words, for example. Unless she means swear words, which we don't say anyhow. I must admit, I'm mystified. And there's something else she says that until now I've thought I must be hearing wrongly. But as danger comes closer, I'm forced to believe she means exactly what she says." Mrs. Beeson paused. She stood still, her blue eyes scanning the crowd. She looked like a queen, Nicky thought, in her ruby-red dress, with the light from the candles gilding her hair. The people in the church seemed to hold their breath. Finally, Mrs. Beeson squared her shoulders and spoke. "What I'm about to say is for the good of us all," she said. "We must be obedient, whether we understand or not. God's ways are beyond our knowing." She paused again for a long time. Tension twisted in Nicky's stomach. People sat so still that the whole room was utterly silent. When Mrs. Beeson spoke next, her voice was hardly above a whisper, but it was so fierce that you could hear every word. "Althea has said it over and over, but I haven't wanted to hear it. No dogs, she says. No dogs. It's quite clear. Somehow, Our dogs are standing in the way." "What?" cried a woman a few rows up, but someone else shushed her. Mrs. Beeson's voice rose. "Yes," she said. "I see it now. I see it in myself, in my own feelings for my little sausage." She leaned forward, gripping the pulpit with both hands. "Why should we give an animal love that should go to our families? Why should we give an animal love that should go to God? We have to act, my dear friends. I know it's hard, but the dogs, all of them, must go." Nicky's heart started rapid-fire beating. Dogs must go? What was she saying? A clamor arose from the people in the church. Voices cried, "What?" and "No!" But Mrs. Beeson spread her arms out and stood like an angel about to rise. "Listen!" she cried. Everyone grew silent again. "It's painful, I know," she said, "but terrible times demand extraordinary sacrifices. Seems to me what the prophet is saying to us is this: the more we say no to the things of the world, all those things we're too attached to, the more we can say yes to God. It's what I've told you before. When you have faith that you're right, you know it from the bottom of your soul, you're willing to do anything for it. Anything." At that, the people grew silent again. A few stood up and left the church. One man shouted, "She's wrong!" as he went out the door. But all the rest stayed. Nicky saw some of them look at each other with stern, brave looks and nod. Then they looked back at her again, waiting for instructions. "It will be like this," she said. "The day after tomorrow, I will send a bus to all dog-owning households. You will put your dog aboard the bus, and the driver will take the dogs to a wild place many miles from here, where the dogs will be free to go back into nature, where they belong. No animal will be harmed. And we here in Yonwood will have followed our instructions to the letter. We will be free to love God with all our hearts." Nicky felt as if she'd been set on fire. "They won't take Otis," she thought. "Never." But she realized after a moment that she didn't have to worry about Otis. No one knew that Greenhaven was a dog-owning household. The only people besides herself who knew about Otis were Amanda and Grover, and they wouldn't hurt him. She would keep him safe. She'd be extra super careful when she took him out to pee, and when the house was sold, she'd take him away with her, back to the city. Because she knew now that she would fail at her goal number 1, which was to live at Greenhaven with her parents. She still loved Greenhaven, and Yonwood too, but she no longer wanted to live in a place where Mrs. Beeson and her prophet delivered instructions from God.